Hello, and welcome to Futuring Is, a sparkling new podcast where we're going to discover the thinkers, dreamers, and doers who are reshaping our world for the better by using the future as a lens. My name is Suzanne Whitby, and I am a futurer and futures researcher, a facilitator, communicator, and storyteller. And everything that I do focuses on how we can co-create what I call hopeful, sustainable futures. These futures aren't utopias or dystopias, but they are futures where we're headed in the right direction. Futures plural because there are many possible futures that exist, limited only by our imagination, which is something that we're going to discuss today, I hope. And futures plural because we're all different. I don't believe that there is a single future that will inspire all of us living today to be the first multi-generational group to shift en masse towards more sustainable ways of living and being. Different versions of hopeful, sustainable futures, the stories that we tell ourselves about how we and the world can be, will vary from place to place and person to person. Today I have the great pleasure to introduce you to someone I met several years ago in the course of my work in climate communication, awareness raising, and sowing the seeds of hopeful, sustainable futures. The rather wonderful Sophia Cheng. Since meeting her, I've been incredibly fortunate to be able to participate in some of her workshops, imagination sessions, and to engage in conversations about life, the universe, and dare I say it, hope. There is a great deal more that I could tell you about Sophia, but in light of time, let me tell you what you need to know. You need to know that since 2019, she has reoriented her work toward the climate and ecological crisis in the pursuit of being useful in the interesting times in which we live. She is the founder of With Many Roots, and she is a facilitator, a connector, and a changemaker. Her 15 plus years of experience includes communications work all over the world with organisations of all kinds, ranging from grassroots indigenous activist groups to multinationals working in the heart of extractive capitalism. She and her family have recently put down firm roots in York, which is in the north of England, and she co-holds spaces locally, including York Cly Connect, People Planet Pint, and widening emotional resilience circles for women. Sophia specialises in having sticky conversations and bringing disparate groups towards consensus, working with often emotionally charged themes and subject matters. She balances her mitigation work with adaptation, exploring what it means to also thrive in these uncertain times. She is part of York's very first co-housing project, Lowfield Green Housing Cooperative. In the Cli-Fi Imaginarium, she's also involved in fact-based group dreaming to imagine the world we know is possible. Her biggest step in this direction is raising a 1-year-old and figuring out what parenting in the Anthropocene looks like today. Sophia, we're so lucky to have you as our very first podcast guest. Thank you so much for coming, and welcome.
Thank you, Suzanne, for having me. I'm really excited for our conversation.
Me too. It's always good to talk to you. So first things first, I know that professionally you position yourself as a facilitator, a connector, and a changemaker, right? We've just heard that. In light of the work that you do with imagination, would you describe yourself as a futurer or an explorer of the future, and why or why not?
I would probably frame myself as a futurer in training. I feel like I'm in the middle of my practice, learning, skilling up, tooling up to be able to do future work well.
And that's really interesting because we don't use the word futures or futurist or futurologist, right, to describe you. And yet, I know that many strands of your work involve futures. It's one of the reasons I invited you today. So, bearing in mind this idea that you're tooling up and so on, which I think you're being overly modest here, but nonetheless, can you talk a bit about what you do that you would describe as relating to futures work or imagining possible futures?
Absolutely. This work didn't come initially out of a professional, heady, intellectual origin. It came as a very emotionally charged need. Is it worth starting there and seeing how that story evolves?
Yes, definitely, go for it.
So, if anyone can remember as far back as 2020, when everything felt a little bleak, and note that we're recording this at the beginning of 2025, where things feel equally quite bleak and very uncertain, I felt compelled after watching documentaries like 2050 to lean into this futures work a lot more, out of an act of personal resilience more than anything. When things felt so uncertain in the present, with so many unknowns, so many different messages flying around about what was important, media hype trying to get clicks with dramatic headlines, it felt hard to hold on to what was real when there was just lots of exponential graphs going upwards in terms of COVID rates and things like that. A mentee of mine came back to me and said, "Do you remember that idea you had, spending some time dreaming up futures that we know are possible? Maybe we need that now." And so in the darkest of days, in the early COVID lockdowns, a few of us came together online to take a climate solution. We picked Project Drawdown as a kind of known, robust resource that we could tool up from and start there. So we picked something really, really dull, relatively, district heating. Right. It's one of those things that a lot of people don't know about. If you Google it, it's dry material, written material, or some people in hard hats kind of walking around. And yet this is one of the climate solutions where I'm from in the UK that is being, talked about quite a lot in urban spaces. And yet we don't really know what it is. So we spent a bit of time as a motley crew dreaming up what that would look like, a community based around district heating. And we let ourselves dream, but crucially, we dreamt together. And we time traveled, and someone would share a nugget from that future, and then we would build on it. We would iterate, and iterate. Never tear anyone's dreams down, but just keep building up and building up. So we had some great early ideas and conversations about a neighbour that was annoyed that their thermostat was like lower than the person next to them, some sort of neighbourly quarrel. We had, what happens at winter when one of the pipes froze and how the community gathered together to fix it. And then we had someone else take on the body of an old coal mine with water running through its veins again, and speaking from the perspective of the mine in its new phase of life. And that was within 15, 20 minutes of just a bunch of people coming together. And then we spent the next chunk writing those fragments of those futures down. And that was a practice we kept coming back to month after month after month. And for me, I couldn't go more than 5 years in the future. I'm not entirely sure where that originates from, a lot of psychological work to tease that apart, but also a cultural norm that we are so centered in the present and the short term that I had never stretched out into the future. And with the climate emergency sort of being raised wherever I was looking, it made it even harder to do that. This practice, as an act of resilience, enabled me to look further into the future by dreaming up solutions we know are possible and imagining them as they were already so. It helped me be braver and braver and braver, and I can now go 350 years into the future. And it's looking not too shabby.
So when I think about some of the advice that you get from the research that's out there, we often talk about moving 10 years into the future, simply because we often think we celebrate 10 years, don't we? We celebrate our 30s and our 40s, not, decades, right? And then when we're thinking about this concept of futures literacy, people like us to go much further out, typically in the range of around 70 years to 100 years. So 350 years, how speculative is that?
I think it is quite speculative, and it makes it playful and not too attached, too bound by what is here around us now that we can touch, see, smell, and taste. But it took time to build up to it. So that was when we were looking at alternative cement. And I was reimagining so I didn't realize some of the Greek buildings, the cement from that was from one of the really big volcanic eruptions that went on at the time. And so I was imagining a future volcanic eruption and what would be built from the ashes of that. And kind of coming out of a cooling period from that moment, and my protagonist heading into a library, which was one of the buildings that the community society had designated as worth building in this really hardy material. So it felt like a different epoch or a different time, a different civilization even. And for me, it felt humbling and refreshing to acknowledge that there was a sense of society and kind of civilization living more lightly that was still managing to thrive on the other side of what seems like quite a tricky transition we're in at the moment.
So in my head, what I'm seeing is Sophia Cheng, 350 years in the future, archaeologist, right? Digging, kind of the classicist of the future. So that really appeals to me with my background in the classics. So a little bit of a digression there. So I'm another thing that I'm curious about, which doesn't necessarily have to do with hopeful, sustainable futures, but given the 350-year timeline that you were playing with there, I'm interested that you weren't all living on Mars or wherever. Did you go to space? Did that come up a lot, or was it very much centered on our planet?
Yeah, a lot of the conversations in the Cli-Fi sessions that would come up month after month is, you know, what are we doing with our planet A? Like, how did we fix planet A? I think there's a whole realm, science fiction, and various versions of climate dystopia that have us in Mars. I am currently rereading Parable of the Sower and hearing about how the government agency for Mars has been shut down by a new incoming president. But I think for my own sense of resilience and hope in our humanity is that we managed to make it work on our own planet.
All right, and I would be with you. I was reading a book today, and I forget the name of the author, but once I find her, I will pop her into the show notes. And the interviewee that she was chatting to made this comment. She said she's an astrophysicist, and she absolutely loves the fact that we explore all of these different planets because they're all rubbish. On every single one of these planets, we just burn or we freeze to death. The only one that we know can really sustain life is this one. So focusing on planet A is a really good place to start, right? When I spoke to you the other day, you spoke to me about a term which I love, and I want you to tell me more about it. You spoke to me about an act of radical imagination, and I want to know, what does that mean to you? And why is that important in the times in which we're living?
An act of radical imagination feels bold and appropriate for our times when news articles, mainstream media, mainstream Hollywood are crafting these narratives for us where the best part of humanity doesn't seem to quite make it, or we're on Mars, or it's taking us somewhere else. So what I love about that radical futures practice is it's the carrot. A lot of what we hear in the present is the stick. Temperatures are getting worse, acidification is getting worse. This new report says we've crossed this new threshold, and that compels us to act, or it compels some of us to act. But it is a bit like the whip, the whip, and that's quite exhausting to kind of work from a place of self-flagellation. Keep going. This is hard. Keep going. The act of radically imagining the world that we want is like looking at that carrot, seeing its beautiful colors, its contours, imagining its crunchiness and its crispiness, giving it depth and going, that is worth getting out of bed for in the morning, again and again and again. And that feels like more of a resilient practice that is going to keep us going when times get tough, which is why I think it's really interesting 5 years on that I'm coming back to this practice with even more vigor, and talking to you, for example, and hearing how the future space seems to be expanding more into the mainstream.
I had a conversation with Rob Hopkins, and he mentioned something very similar to you, but the way he put it, and I wonder if you agree with this, was that many of the people who talk about climate change, they're talking about all of this, everything's going to hell in a handcart, it's all going to be terrible, we're all going to die, it's going to be really awful. And he said he doesn't feel comfortable about other people colonizing the future for us, right? That we have this opportunity to potentially shape our own futures. And That's what I'm hearing from the way you've just described your interpretation of radical imagination. Would you agree, or am I putting words in your mouth?
No, I think you're right. It feels counterculture, it feels bold, it feels kind of not accepting the status quo. It it feels also like an act of agency rather than letting the future happen to us. It's kind of realizing, no, I have power. I have power in various forms, and one of the ways that I use my power is to dream up worlds and then think about what I can build about those future worlds right now. And to acknowledge that a lot of this inspiration does come from Rob Hopkins. I saw him speak about what is in January 2020 with the Australian wildfires going on, and it was out of his time travel venture that I started our own one. And I think, can I build in as well this link to looking forward, but actually how it addresses now. I think the Helena Hancock picture is is very easy. It's quite seductive. It's giving up your power in many ways, and absolving yourself of some of that responsibility. And that's not just from an individual perspective, but a sort of societal wide story. What the practice of future dreaming in these small groups had very real consequences in my present. So as I was able to go further and further into the future, I thought, oh, okay, well, in that case, if there's going to be a decent-ish future where I have an active stake and I have agency, I'll put away some savings. So I started some long-term savings and opened a stocks and shares savings account in the UK with an ethical bank, Triodos. And the other thing it gave me the courage to do in the present was to turn towards the question of motherhood. If you can't look more than a couple of years into the future, the sort of idea of bringing new life or being responsible for a small person, it has kind of very obvious clash points. So the practice of future imagining and future dreaming led me to explore motherhood and turn towards it in a way I never had courage to do before.
When I introduced you earlier on, I said that you were a facilitator, a connector, and a changemaker. So I wonder if you need to add future shaper to your list of to your list of talents, right? I'm glad that you mentioned narrative. We've obviously been talking about stories in some shape, form, or fashion. And I think I do lots of oral storytelling and I teach storytelling. And I would say that the core of the work that I do with futures and foresight is very much involved with, telling stories of the future and seeing whether we can work backwards to a place where this is desirable, this isn't desirable, how do we potentially get from, where we are now to where we want to be. And I'm curious about your thoughts. Can you tell me more about the role of storytelling in your work? Why structure fact-based dreaming in a story framework rather than simply listing the facts step by step? I feel like I might know the answer, but I want to know, why you think that works and why that works for you, right? Because it might not work for everyone.
Absolutely. A lot of reckoning, a lot of practicing communicating facts, and that only going so far with various audiences. And a thread running through my career has been making hard stuff more accessible. I remember in my first job, we were looking at deforestation, and it was very, very complicated because it's all EU legislation and quite impenetrable. And I remember speaking to a campaigner activist for the newsletter we were writing, and I was like, oh, so you're trying to do what Jamie Oliver did for chicken. You're trying to do that for trees. And once I could make that connection into kind of a cultural not a me, but a cultural conversation that was really live at the time, I knew we had our way in. So I think for me, it's framed around how do we make this stuff more accessible? And stories are everywhere. Stories are in casual conversation, they're in the news articles that we read, they're in the stories that we share with our children, pass the time with, pay money to go to the cinema and see. So they are a culturally accessible tool. And yet, again, we sort of default that those other people are the storytellers. So what I was quite inspired and alarmed by was actually maybe we need to be our own best storytellers. So we started the Cli-Fi Imaginarium with a science fiction writer who could act as our sister guide to help us own our own stories, and the power that had. I remember in its climate outreach, his research back in 2019 that looked at, some of the reasons people don't talk about climate change is because they don't feel confident about the science, but also because they didn't feel skilled enough to have a conversation. And their data showed that when we frame the conversations in forms of stories and anecdotes, that actually they were more effective. And so it's kind of pulling on what we already know to be true, like the glazed look people get when you start going to story mode and they kind of relax and sort of take it in. Maybe that's a childlike memory coming back, but also the data that's out there that says this is the way people learn. And what I love about like novels, why are we drawn to novels, is we never get to be in someone else's head except our own unless we read a story. And so that kind of compulsion to know what's under the skin, what makes someone's cogs turns, the main character, what drives a person, we can access other people's worlds through story. And I found that quite appealing, and not because I was good at it, but because I knew it'd be worth practicing getting good at it. So that's why we took the kind of story form in the early stage of our Imaginarium play.
So there are three things that I've sort of picked up that you've spoken about now, and also in previous comments that you've said. So one thing is that you spoke about, going into a novel, going into somebody else's head. So this idea about stories, and in your case, stories of the future, to transport us, right, to take us to a different place. And then earlier on, you spoke a little bit about the sensory stuff, right? You spoke about touch, taste, smell, and so on. So transporting us through the medium of story into a place where we can experience a different place, a different time, a different world through all of our senses, which makes it sticky. And I know, of course, this again is something that's very important for you, communicating sticky messages, right? And so it sounds like storytelling is a really vital vehicle for this. And then the third thing that came to mind was you spoke about the work that you've been doing as an act of personal resilience, I think you said, correct me if I'm wrong, and then you mentioned something about agency, sense of agency, and so much of this agency is tied up, I think, to the stories, or with the stories that we tell ourselves, right? Oh, I can't do it. Oh, you know what, it's somebody else's problem. Oh, actually it's the corporates. Oh, it's actually the government. Oh, I'm only one drop in the ocean, right? So kind of playing with these stories, creating new narratives, challenges the way that we're thinking. Really, really interesting. Thank you so much. So you've spoken a bit about the Cli-Fi dreaming, right, your Imaginarium, and this is, how would you describe that? Very citizen-based, ordinary, everyday people, right? Okay. So Sophia's nodding for those of you who can't hear the nods, right? What I'm interested in is, where else do you take this futuring work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it came out of a personal need and realizing that other individuals might need it as well. So the original tool was for curious souls and citizens. Playing with it and realizing how impactful the practice could be led me to look for and ideate on practices that we could use in different places for different audiences. So one of the sessions that we've run that I really loved running, actually, it was really lovely, was with the Woodlands Trust. And the people on the front line of their campaign work and their public relations. And you think of anyone on the front line of this, on the NGO sector, trying to, push for policy changes and getting whiplash based on, who's in power at the time and kind of promises being pulled from them and things like that. It's hard work. It's hard to kind of stay with it. And so after the heat wave in 2022, one of the employees there was kind of reaching out to her colleagues from a kind of with an emotional request to kind of check in. How does this feel? And so together we built a program. We called it an innovism practice, kind of a creative resilience practice. So over a season, her and our colleagues, because we again wanted to make sure it wasn't in an individual practice, this was a practice to do together. Across the course of 3 months, we had 3 weeks each of coming together. And the first was based on kind of composting, climate cafe, acknowledging our pain. So pulling in some of the Joanna Macy spiral work. And then the second session was the future dreaming. And then the third session was the myth making, right? So not only is this a muscle of imagination that we want to practice and do it in a collaborative kind of way and see what we can dream up, but then how do we take it beyond? How do we disperse these seeds of the future beyond the group that have gathered here today? And again, each month we stretched our time length a little more, pulling on ideas from the good ancestor, these ideas of deep time, long time, and being able to shift on different temporal spectrums, like the short term and the much longer term, and pulling in practices from the Long Time Academy and some of their reflective meditation practices in there. And I think what was really interesting is how they could all look at their work in a slightly different way, and pull on this futures as a resource when the times got tough. And we got really good feedback from the participants. It was a little bit different to a kind of normal employee program. Well, it didn't suit everyone, but for those that, the majority of the people that stuck it out, they all came together at a team meeting a few months afterwards around the fire and shared some of their early drafts with each other, as again, a kind of complementary but alternative way of reflecting on the work that they do and how far they've come.
So really interesting again, because you said earlier on, in terms of, are you a future? And you said, well, I'm still playing with my tools and putting my toolkit together. And yet you talk about myth making. And there is a very famous a futurist, really, one of the forefathers, I think, of a lot of the futures methods that we use at the moment. His name is Suhail Inayatullah, and he created something called causal layered analysis. And he talks about, you start off with a litany, this is the world as it is, right? Then you look at the systemic causes that are underlying, then you're looking at the worldview, and the last thing that you're doing is you're looking at the metaphors and the myths that are holding up the system. And his whole way of working is saying, so these are the myths that are holding up this system that we have at the moment, right? This world that we have now. What world do we want in the future, and how does the myth change? How does the underlying myth change? So it's really interesting that you've just intuitively built that in, right? That's really fascinating. So one of the things I'm curious about, I feel like you're very brave to bring something like this into a business organization. Did you have any challenges bringing this way of thinking into the organization? Was there any pushback? Was there any discomfort that people felt playing with this? Because playing with stories and myths can expose you, can make you feel quite vulnerable, right? You're opening yourself up in a very big way to just colleagues.
Yeah, and there was a few, we framed it as a pilot, and I think working really closely with two stakeholders that included a representative from the well-being kind of perspective in the organization, meant that we were always kind of sound checking, like, how do we think this is going to land, and refining the design, and refining it as we went along. We always asked for feedback. It got some resistance in some ways, that the way our current present world likes the bucket people. You're either creative or you're not. And so those that had predetermined or been told by other people that they were not creative did find this quite a struggle. And again, sort of part of this futures work is unpicking, like you say, some of these myths that, yeah, you need an A star in it to be any good at it. And partly, actually, probably why I'm saying I'm a futurist in training is because I don't feel like I've got the gold star or the A star from any institution in particular. I still feel like I'm kind of emerging. So that process of unlearning the hierarchies of whether we're good at anything is still very much live for me. And so from the participants' perspective, a couple of people dropped out. They said that, I wasn't sure what I was expecting, and this wasn't it. But the fact that we got buy-in from a senior leader that meant that people could take that time. And that senior leader had been on a 2-day retreat with me where we did some deep time practices and we stepped forwards a couple of generations in time, and it was quite an emotive exercise with those in the room. I think her experience of that allowed her to see that this could be a valuable exercise for some of her colleagues and her team. So I think I would get more pushback in other places. I would love to be testing this with different audiences, maybe with sustainability professionals, sustainability consultants that have to maybe water down, some of their original drafts as it meets, business priorities and things like that. Like, who are the people that need to keep going at this, and how do we encourage people to carve out the time and potentially the money, because it takes resources to do this as well, that on an activity that might be worth doing in the long term. I think it's hard to quantify the ROI. Again, if we're using very present day metrics or metrics obsessed as we are in the present day, it is quite hard to quantify. But the ability to have that carrot and to be able to keep going and keep doing the work you're at feels really valuable, even if I can't put a specific number on how valuable that is.
It's difficult, isn't it, if we're working with, as you say, the existing present metrics to try and evaluate the success of these things. So you've spoken a bit about sustainability professionals, and obviously I understand, where that goes, because they're hopefully going to be creating the vision and potentially drawing the company further. I wonder if there's still a really good case for taking this kind of work, which is this work of creativity, of creation, of imagination, into corporates, and not just to the leadership team. This is something that really irritates me. We focus a lot on the leadership team. Obviously, leaders are important, but a company is not this abstract entity. It's made up of people. And if every single person is able to envision what they want to see in the context of work, but also in the context of other parts of their life, and see what role they have in their company to manifest that. And manifest is a bit of a risky word to use because it might kind of sound as if it's coming from the alternative sector. I feel that that's very powerful. So is this something that you would potentially risk taking into, for example, a bank, the stock exchange, right? Parliament. I'm sure politicians are imagining this stuff all the time anyway. But what about these? What did you call it earlier on? You had a particular extractive industries. What's your feeling about that?
I would absolutely love to, and there is data, and please don't quote me on the specificity of this, but the organisations that have a culture that leans towards more innovation, and a culture that does that needs people to take risks, needs people to be able to try things, tends to be more successful in the long term. So I feel this is kind of almost like a precursor to allowing that to happen, and a precursor for helping people find their agency. A lot of what I'm doing in some of those extractive industries at the moment is kind of present day climate education and climate awareness. And I almost want to kind of, after a successful one of those workshops of kind of mapping out the current day, is I'd love to spend a lot longer, because we don't get enough time, going, what do you want this to be? What do you want this to be? And also seeding ideas, small pockets in the present that could be in a large organization, be, rapidly built up to scale, and also kind of talking about worker-led decarbonisation. And actually some of that we need to go to the past to see pockets of that, and then go, so it has been done before. This isn't totally beyond the realm of the possible, but what would that look like today? What would that look like, if we put these structures in place in 10, 20, 30 years? And I think, those working in more of the extractive industries and the heavy industries, particularly in manufacturing, it's also exploring, what does a fulfilling job look like? What are we manufacturing at scale? I was learning this phrase, socially valuable work, socially valuable products. So going into organizations, kind of asking those questions and dreaming those up would be a phenomenal privilege. And I think the ripple effect would be quite vast. Risky, risky if you're still in that leadership position, bound by some of our present day metrics and our kind of, if you're only looking at the next quarterly report, it might, not seem to align. But I think it's bold, and I think it's where some of the braver organisations are maybe ready to look towards.
So it's really interesting that you say risky. When I think about some of the organisations that I had in mind, so the stock market springs to mind. I don't know why that's on my mind today, but that's on my mind. Maybe because the markets have been jumping up and down. Stockbrokers they love risk, right? They take massive risks with huge amounts of money. I mean, they're calculated risks, but risks nonetheless. So is there really a massive risk in investing 2 or 3 days or 5 days worth of time, to see whether you can create something better, to see whether you can become more resilient, as you've already pointed out with this research, right? And all of that research that you mentioned, this is all backed by all of the research that happens in the futures and foresight world, right? Having that ability to look into the future, also looking at the past, seeing what's been done before, looking at opportunities and risks, looking at what you want to create and how you can align all of those things, I think is a very powerful thing. This also just reminds me briefly, you mentioned earlier on that one of the pushbacks that you had in the Woodlands Trust project was that some people felt that they weren't creative, right? That, after the age of 5, you can't be creative anymore, right? We're all useless at drawing. Yeah. And I'm just thinking as well that all of these people, the stockbrokers, the bankers, the innovation people, the people who are working in so-called not creative jobs, the people who are working in supermarkets, you have to imagine what a shop window is going to look like. You have to imagine what it's going to look like when you stock your baked beans in a row, or imagine what happens if you invest 5 billion, insert your currency here, and what might happen in the future, right? So I think we've all got this power. So it feels, if anybody's listening and interesting companies like stockbrokers and banking firms and these big sort of traditional corporate firms, Sophia wants to come and play with you. If your leaders are bold enough, right, are interested in playing with something new. Wonderful. So you've spoken about the Cli-Fi Imaginarium. You've spoken about the Woodlands Trust project. Are there any other projects where you've played with the futures, whether they're corporate or with sustainability professionals or with civilians or citizens, that you think are particularly interesting and worthwhile mentioning because they give us a new angle on your work?
Yeah, so I'd love to share where the Cli-Fi Imaginarium is going. So we've just convened a small group of dreamers who were doing this with us. We were doing this in 2020, and we met people along the way doing this work. So we have perspectives from the US, from South Africa, from different life experiences as well, going, how do we do this? Because I think it was a little bit of like me leading something. And again, if we're trying to reimagine what cooperative work looks like, I wanted the process of how a group comes together to model some of those future practices. So a group of us ideated what we'd like to play with. And I think what we want to do is turn it into a playground where we take a future theme. And I think we can talk about climate, but I think after 5 years of working on climate, we know it's much bigger than that. Like, what are the other institutions and parts of our lives that we need to unpick if every part of society needs to transition? So we could be looking at future families, future schools, future institutions, political ones, the world of business. We could get techie, but then have a different angle on it. So sometimes it might be the storytelling approach that I have found really valuable and tooled up on, but also we could play with a history lesson, or it could be a radio interview from someone that's very an elderly person that's like looking back, or a quiz show, or actually let's all get on our online neural board and put pictures in and kind of create this future visually. So we wanted to see if we could play with other formats as well as storytelling, to see if we could be more accessible to more people, and then look at a playful playground practice And then think about how do we take this out. So always having a kind of seed dispersing section to our session, whether that's putting something on the Imaginarium on the webpage, whether that's having a conversation about it next time with your friend, maybe that's asking a question in your next class that you're attending, maybe that's speaking to your local MP about the idea that came up in your session. Like, practice the skill and sharing, practice the skill and sharing. And so how do we kind of influence a futures practice beyond the people that kind of are drawn to it, as well as getting them out, even if we don't see ourselves as artists, as writers, as we're just playing. And we're the playful, we want to be whimsical about it, we want to be lighthearted about it, to see who else, how can we broaden the umbrella and welcome more people in.
And I think this concept of play is so important. When I talk about futures, I have these conversations. I run little workshops every month just to play with different ideas. And I tell people it doesn't matter what you come up with. It can be absolutely awful. It can be absolutely fantastic, because you know what? It doesn't exist, right? The futures that you imagine, they're all just little imagination things. They don't exist. And even if you do your best right now in the here and now to shape the future, you're working at 350 years in one of your examples, right? The chances that what you are trying to shape now is going to be the future in 350 years, minimal, right? But it doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. It's not worth playing with that exercise and seeing where it takes you, right? Because you never know what you can change. So I think that's really, really, really interesting. And so this Imaginarium, your playground, can people get involved with that? Is that something that's a closed group? What is your vision for that in the future?
So we are going to pick the baton back up again in April, and we meet on the second Monday of the month, every month. And that is going to be one of these themes and one of these formats, one of these future themes and one of these playful formats. And there'll be a rotating host. So we'll be bringing in like different perspectives, different lived experience. It could be Lili's a poet, for example. Peterson focuses on audio. Alison loves story. Jen does different workshops in her local community. So she'll be wanting to reach a kind of more global audience by practicing some of her stuff online. So that's it so far, and then we want to open the invitation out, because we'll invite people to host it if they want to, or just come along and play, because we know you need to have a certain level of capacity to be ready to do this, and maybe you just want to be in listening mode, then you might want to participate, and then you might want to host. So we want to make those options available for everyone as well.
And so it's really one of those safe spaces, although I don't like that. I can't remember where I picked this up, but I read somewhere that there are no safe spaces, because anything can go wrong in any space, anywhere, but there are brave spaces, spaces where you show up and you participate as much or as little as you want, until you're ready to participate more, right? So that's what you're creating, right? That wonderful brave space. Fantastic. So you'll provide me with all the information about that, which I can pop into the show notes so that people can follow up on that. So the two sort of related questions here, I'll try to ask them one at a time. I have a bad habit of putting 5 questions in a row, right? So the first question is, somebody's listening and they're thinking, oh, I'm not entirely sure that I can participate in an online session. I don't necessarily have the money, or maybe I'm in a different country. I can't bring Sophia to me. What would you recommend that person does to start putting some of this radical imagination, futures thinking, whatever you want to call it, into practice in their everyday life to help them deal with the uncertainty of these curious times?
That is a great question. 2 things are coming to mind, and a third gentle entry, very low barrier to entry. I think when I always want to do something I don't know that much about, when I'm at the beginning of something, I always look to the people who I think know more, or find those people. So as you mentioned, you're speaking with Rob Hopkins. Check them out. Their book From What Is to What If, they have a great blog. Like, who can you start, maybe Suzanne, your work, who can you start following, who can you start being inspired from and hearing from, so that what's entering your your newsfeed and your inbox starts to be a bit more futures orientated, because that kind of encourages you and nudges you in that direction. I think a really specific entry point might be the Long Time Academy and their series there. It's a little bit different because they look backwards and forwards, but it's really stretching that notion of time. And with each episode comes a practice. And there's one where based on Joanna Macy's framework of ancestral jumping forward in time is a great place to practice. And then my second suggestion is find a friend. Don't do this on your own. If you're brave enough to kind of be curious about practicing this, see if there's someone else you can practice it with. And that might be a case of, sharing something between you about this topic, raising it in conversation, or actually having a go at some of the exercises that get mentioned, doing it together. I think once you take it beyond yourself, even in that nascent beginning phase, it's so much more fun. It makes it so much more real, and potentially, if you're like me, it makes you more accountable to doing the practice anyway. So I have a wonderful accountability buddy where I do a lot of this work from, and I'm a much better person because I actually do the things that I wanted to do. And then the third kind of lowest barrier to entry, if you feel like you just want to feed on little drops of hope written by other people, I invite you to visit the Cli-Fi Imaginarium on withmanyroots.com. And they are very short stories, flash fiction, written by people that have never really done it before or are practicing this. So it gets a sense of, oh, okay, like I can probably do that too. And if that makes you feel a bit braver to go on to another practice, then it will have done its job more than once over.
Fantastic. So I can wholeheartedly recommend popping over to With Many Roots and following up on the Cli-Fi Imaginarium, because I confess to have been a lurker there in the past and enjoyed some of the stories. I still remember there was a story about a bog that for whatever reason is very present in my mind. So if you only read one story, read my story. It's not my story, but the story that I've just mentioned about the bog. Okay, so I'm curious. I'm sort of mindful about time. So just a couple of last bits and pieces that I want to pull out of your wonderful, wonderful and wise brain. Dealing with stuff like climate change, grappling with the decision about having a child in the Anthropocene, dealing with all of the wicked problems that we have, and in that space being this facilitator, connector, changemaker, future shaper. Ta-da! A new title, right? I'm curious to know, how do you recharge and maintain balance with all of this stuff going on?
That's a great question. It's not something I'm very well conditioned at, so it has to be quite an intentional thing. And for me, it's my futures practice. My futures practice is part of my resilience toolkit. It's part of my resetting, remembering that things aren't fixed and defined, and just because they look one way now doesn't mean they'll look this way forever. So I come back to the Imaginarium, I read those little drops of hope myself, but convening with other people who want to practice this too fills me with just the perfect antidote to scrolling on a newsfeed or spending too much time looking at a 24-hour news cycle. So it brings me back to a playful pace, and I'm a much stronger person for it.
Okay, and just to pull out a couple of things there that I think are really important, and again, this has been this wonderful thread that has been coming through our conversation. So the one is the playfulness. The secondness is this, I'm going to call it futures practice, but really it's this this fluidity with time, right? Going back, playing in the past, playing in the future, looking at the present, and so on, right? And then the third thing that I think I'm hearing, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is that this isn't stuff that you're doing on your own. It's a collaborative practice, and that, to some extent, is also part of the resilience building. Can you speak a little bit about why that's important, this collaborative piece?
I think it's fundamental. But I've arrived at that point after years and years of thinking I needed to do it on my own. Very much sold this hero's journey on I've got to be the superhero. If I can't fix climate change, then it probably is my fault. And then I should roll over and give up. And going, hold on a second, that was never true. We've always done this stuff in group. Group storytelling is another nut I need to crack, but at least group coming together to practice this work. I have only found my courage to do any of this work when I've been doing it with other people. And so I rarely start any of this work on my own. It might not be pulling a team together to do a specific project, but it will always be like referring it back to someone. How does this land for you? What do you think about this? What's pulling you into this direction? It makes it more real when it lives beyond your brain, when there's more than a few minds working on the same thing. It keeps the momentum going. There's no single point of failure. There isn't as much pressure, but there's more momentum and there's more energy. We can carry people who are struggling at any one point and still kind of keep moving in the direction we want to. It just feels absolutely fundamental. And a really recent example of that is joining a housing cooperative. And we have a 999-year lease. We're soon going to get a piece of paper and, building and land, which we will be guardians of for 999 years. I'm doing that with 15 or 16 other households and exploring, what does it mean to be a guardian of this piece of land for that long? And I just find that so energizing.
And I think this is a really positive point to almost end on, because I have one more thing to ask you. And this idea that we're not alone, that you do not have to do this alone, right? That creating or co-creating hopeful, sustainable futures is group work, right? It's something that we all have a part to play in. And I think I think sometimes that one of the things that puts people off climate action, sustainability action, insert your particular challenge that you want to tackle here, this idea that we feel that we have to do it on our own, and we really don't have to, and it works better with others. So that's very positive.
That's one of those myths.
Yes, exactly.
That we need to unpick.
Well, yeah, and well, this can go into a whole different conversation, right? Is this more of a male problem or a female problem? But as I say, different conversation for a different day. What I would like to know is, as we sort of bring things to a close, is there anything else that you had on your mind that you really wanted to share with people about futures, about time, about change, about shaping, that we haven't touched upon today, that you think would just be useful to end with?
I suppose the most real thing that has come out of my practice of future dreaming and group dreaming with others is my son, who is now 1, and how much I have learned and will continue to learn through a creative kind of act to bring him into the world, and how his play is his learning. All of his learning is through play. And for me, it reminds me of what we need to bring back into our kind of adult world or serious world or business world, or, whatever word you want to put in there. And it just reminds me from where I started out 5 years ago, where it had to be all about sacrifice. It's very conditioned into the zero-sum game. You've got to stop doing this, stop, stop. Give yourself 40 lashes for the terrible person that you are, and then kind of keep going. And how exhausting that was, and how this process over the last 5 years of unlearning has reminded me how much space there is to create, and how much more energizing, hopeful, playful that world is.
And what a world we have to look forward to if we can adopt some of that thinking. Wow, thank you so much. My lovely Sophia, I think that we are coming up to the hour. So on that note, I want to say thank you so much for being our very first guest. Very, very exciting. Something that was dreamed, not in Sophia's Imaginarium, but nonetheless dreamed and now created. And now it feels like a real thing because you've got the gorgeous Sophia with us. Sophia, thank you so much, and I will pop all of your details in the show notes. And again, if anybody has ideas for Sophia, opportunities for Sophia, ways to connect her to places that need her future dreaming and the future dreaming of the Cli-Fi Imaginarium, please get in touch with her. It sounds as if the combination of Sophia's approach and the tools that she uses, they have the potential to create marvelous shifts in an organization, really transformational shifts that can make organizations braver and bolder and more resilient and perhaps even better. And on that note, my lovely Sophia, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. And I look forward to listening to the future episodes of your podcast. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of Futuring Is. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you feel inspired to do some future dreaming of your own. If you want to hear more from thinkers, dreamers and doers who are reshaping our world for the better by using the future as a lens, you can subscribe to the podcast on your favourite podcasting tool or subscribe to the Futuring Is newsletter at www.futuringis.com, and I'll send you a personal note to tell you when new episodes appear. Last but not least, if you're a thinker, dreamer or doer who is reshaping our world for the better using the future as a lens, or if you know someone who fits that description, please get in touch. Perhaps you'd be the perfect guest for the next podcast. And that's it for today. Until we meet again, I hope that you go well, stay well, and find time to plant seeds that grow into hopeful, sustainable futures.